Yeah, so this is Henry from Cairns Institute, so here the local host institution. Today I want to present one of the papers from my PhD, so I want to acknowledge my thesis supervisors, Professors Graham Cumming and Michelle Barnes. And I will be presenting the results from a paper we published in Global Environmental Change. So that was in July of this year, so this is pretty recent work. And it's a bit of a complicated title, but I'll get back to that. So yes, as many everyone here knows, coral reefs are one of the most heavily impacted ecosystems by climate change, and probably also one of the first, right, compared to other ecosystems. So we can learn a lot what's happening here. And there's many industries that are dependent on healthy coral reefs. So we have our fisheries, we have our reef tourism, and we have many others as well. But we don't really know how these industries are adapting to the loss of coral reefs or to heavy impacts on reefs. And that's what I did in this study. So we investigated tourism operators' responses to climate impacts and how that their response was mediated by their adaptive capacity. Yeah, just so the paper has a lot of like theoretical and methodological complexity. So I'll just keep it relatively simple. But if you're interested, I would recommend to read the paper. But basically, why it's important what we're doing is that nowadays there's a lot of literature on adaptive capacity. So the benefit of looking at adaptive capacity is that you can kind of know before someone is affected whether they will have the capacity to adapt. So instead of waiting for something to happen and then see if people can respond, we actually try to see if we can know beforehand. So that's why that literature is really exploding. But one thing which is really missing is we don't really know if adaptive capacity is actually a good proxy for whether people can adapt when they are affected. So there's a big theoretical discussion about that. There have been some empirical papers which actually have shown that people that's supposed to have high adaptive capacity, they were actually not better able to adapt when they were affected. So there's some problems there as well, like how do you measure adaptive capacity? Are we measuring the right things, et cetera, et cetera? So that's kind of what we're doing with this paper. So the method, so we looked at reef tourism operators all around the Asia Pacific. So we did around 230 reef tourism surveys. Yeah, so we looked at really actual adaptation to climate disturbances. So a major one here was the 2016 bleaching event. So we sampled all the major bleaching and cyclone events between 2014 and 2019, so 5-year period. And we also included both companies that were affected and companies that weren't affected. And it was really a deductive design. So we had like categorized responses. We had like, what does it say there? Like 16 indicators of adaptive capacity. And we also used contextual indicators. So it was really like a really wide range of things that we measured. Just for some of the results. So I just said that there was like, we measured about like 10 different responses to climate change impacts, such as bleaching and cyclones that tourism operators could have used. So basically what we found here is a bit complicated figure, but we found that some of these were correlated. So some operators did multiple responses. And we found from that correlation that there were kind of 3 clusters of responses. So there were basically what we called coping responses. So that's either doing nothing or doing some kind of relief measures like selling your boats or firing your stuff. So that's kind of an undesired response. There were adaptive responses. So these were kind of things you do to buffer the impacts, right? So you might change to different reef sites in response to bleaching, etc. So that helps, but it doesn't really alleviate some of the problems. And then what we call the transformative responses, that were really actions that could affect the long-term outcomes of the social ecological system. So that's what we work with in the rest of our analysis. So in the analysis, here is the indicators of adaptive capacity that we use. So really use the broad range of indicators over 6 different domains. So this is the adaptive capacity framework that's built on the work by Josh Sinner and Michelle Barnes. So that was one of my supervisors. So for example, in terms of the assets, you could think about whether companies have a lot of savings that could give them adaptive capacity, flexibility, whether they have a lot of different sites they can go to, social organization, whether they have good relationship with government, for example, with research institutions. Learning is about employee involvement and the education of the management. Social cognitive factors like confidence, competing concerns, reef attachment, and agency is really about like participation in management and whether they have like some kind of exclusive access to their reef sites. So we were really interested to looking at how these indicators of adaptive capacity were associated with whether companies were more likely to respond in an adaptive or transformative way when they were impacted by climate disturbance. So this is the results. So this is, we used a multinomial regression model. So this basically compares whether companies were more likely to prioritize either adaptive or transformative responses compared to doing nothing. So that's kind of the undesired response. So we'll just show the most, highlight the most meaningful results that we found. So really interesting that for the adaptive responses, that was really highly affected by the disturbance severity. So how much of these, or how much of the reef sites of an operator were severely bleached or severely damaged by a cyclone. So that was really the major predictor of adaptive responses. We also found an effect from industry membership. So companies that had membership in industry organizations were more likely to take adaptive action as well. In terms of the transformative action, we found that industry membership and research ties, so ties to research institutions, were a meaningful predictor for transformative responses. And then interestingly, we found a negative relationship with adaptation confidence. So companies that were more confident in their ability to adapt, they were less likely to take transformative action. And another interesting one we didn't expect is that companies in countries with higher government effectiveness like Australia, they were less likely to prioritize transformative action compared to other countries like Indonesia with lower government effectiveness. So the key findings, first of all, one of the implications is that the domain of social organizations, social networks is a major predictor of transformative responses to climate change. So that could really mean that if we focus more of our money on like helping people to connect with each other and to collaborate, that could be more effective in kind of promoting transformative change. And then we found that the prioritization of adaptive measures, that was really highly affected by the severity and not so much by adaptive capacity. So adaptive capacity isn't really a good proxy for whether people will adapt to climate change. We find that if companies are highly affected by climate change, they will take adaptive action. Doesn't matter if they don't have money or they have to do something. So that's kind of a interesting finding there. We also found that operators that are less worried about climate change, so that could be kind of linked to that adaptation confidence, right? If they are more confident, they might be less worried. They were less likely to take transformative responses. So this really goes against all the climate change literature, especially in psychology, that says like, hey, if people have more self-efficacy, more confidence in their ability to do something, they're more likely to do something. But we found a negative effect, so that was quite interesting. And then we also found that effect in people in countries with lower government effectiveness, so countries like Indonesia and the Mariana Islands and Fiji in our case, they were actually more likely to take transformative action. So we discussed that in light of like, it might be that in countries like Australia, there might be some regulatory barrier to become active in restoration, for example, right? You cannot just go out to do regular restoration without a permit. But one thing we also think is that, like, for example, operators in Indonesia, they might be more like, they cannot depend on the government to take transformative action. So they kind of take it in their own hands. So that's also my anecdotal experience from working in Bali. That was one of my research sites. So I think that was the end. This is one of the other research sites in Okinawa. Pretty nice place to snorkel, dive. Thank you.